Hello, it is time for my first reading wrap up of 2021. I wanted a carefree reading year this year where I just picked up anything I wanted without putting any pressure on myself to read certain books or a certain type of book. I just wanted to see where the mood would take me, and it has been a surprisingly good tactic. I've had so much fun reading so far this year, and there are lots of books that I can't wait to talk to you about and insist that you read because it's been such a good year so far. Once again, this year I am logging everything I read in my reading diary. I did this last year where each month I would note down on each page per month which books I'd read. So there's a page for January, February, March and so on. And I thought that worked really well, so I am doing it again this year and highlighting, for example, the classics that I read so I can see them very easily, and at the end of the year know how many I've read because I run the Classic Community Reading Challenge. So it's good to know how many classics that I read. It has really taken any of that pressure away, and it's less about finishing books and more about enjoying the books I read. I'd really recommend doing this if you don't already. But enough of that, let's talk about some books, and I thought I would talk to you first about the classics that I have read so far in 2021. I'm not sure if the first one counts as a classic, but it's in a kind of middle category where I feel like it might count. I haven't counted it, but I still loved it so much. I think it might be my favourite book of the year, and I've talked about it in a previous wrap up, but I hadn't finished it then, and it was one of the first books that I finished in 2021, and it is called Look Back with Love, and it's by Dodie Smith, who you might know for writing I'd Capture the Castle and also the 101 Dalmatians. And this is the first part of a 4-part autobiography. It's not very well known now. I've never seen anybody talk about it, but it's one of the best books that I have ever read, and I loved it and wish that I could erase my memory and read it all over again for the first time. I'm reading this because I'm currently writing a book set during the Edwardian era, which I'm loving so much. It's so much fun to do all the research, to really get into the minds of what it would be like to be an Edwardian girl. And Dodie Smith was an Edwardian girl. She grew up in the early 1900s, and she's talking about her life mainly in the suburbs around Manchester, which has also been really good for my research. This is a very warm and cosy book that you're very much reading through the lens of nostalgia. She's looking back with love at her life at this very early age where the memories are kind of hazy, but also when you do remember something, it's incredibly vivid. Dodie Smith's father died when she was very young, so she was raised by her mother and her uncles and also her grandparents, and I loved reading about each of her uncles. They were really into the stage and theatricals, and there was a lot of music and acting in the house. There was lots of mentions of different plays and Dodie's sense of performance as well, and I loved the tiny details and the tiny stories of things that you would read in a history book and you would gloss over, but because she's telling it as she remembers it, it just seems all the more important. And it is unfortunately quite difficult to come by a copy of this these days. This was published by Slightly Foxed, so if you can get a copy, please read it. It's one of the best books I have ever read, and I don't say that lightly. I know I said literally 2 seconds ago that I don't say something like that lightly, but I'm gonna say it again. January was such a good reading month for me. I read another book that completely blew me away. I think, again, it's just one of the best things I've ever read. And this is a book called Business as Usual by Jane Oliver and Anne Stafford. And I raced through this in, I think, an afternoon. I could not put it down. I did not want to finish it, but at the same time, I just had to know what would happen. This was published in 1933, and it's about a young woman called Hilary who has been engaged, but it's going to be a very long engagement. So in the meantime, she moves to London and gets a job in a department store. More specifically, at first, she's working in the book department, and she's not particularly brilliant at her her job, she seems to mess things up. But then somebody spots something in her and she starts to get better, she starts to improve, and seeing her on that journey is so wonderful. This is told in letter form and there are also illustrations, and even though it was told in letters, it reminded me of something like the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, in that because it's written in letters, it doesn't detract from the story, it only adds to it. This is published by a publisher called Handheld Press, who release classics that were written a long time ago but have been sadly out of print, and I'm so glad that they decided to publish this so that more people can read it and enjoy it. There was such a lovely love story at the heart of this, but it was more about Hilary's journey and her as a character, and I can see myself rereading this very soon. In fact, I'd quite like to one day write something like this. It really captured my imagination and made me think about what life was like at this time, what it was like to be a working woman, and the joy of that, but also the extreme difficulties. And it also made me think about the way that stories are told and how we can be adventurous in that, because I think everything about this was utter perfection. I picked it up by chance, but my god, I'm so glad that I did. I want everybody to read this. Please, if you don't take anything else from this video, make sure that you read Business as Usual, because I don't think you'll regret it. Then the other classic I have read so far this year is Vera by Elizabeth von Arnim. This book, what can I say about it? It was such a ride. Oh my gosh, I could not put this down, but the closer I got to the ending, the more I actually had to put it down because it creeped me out so much. It was so intense. I had to keep putting it down because even though I wanted to know what would happen, I didn't want anything bad to happen, and I was sure that something bad was going to happen, and so I was reading it between the pages like this, like, oh, can I bear it? Can I bear it? It was so intense, and that's what makes it such a fantastic book. This is very much like Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. It was written first, so I think that Daphne du Maurier probably took inspiration from it, and by probably I mean the plot is so similar, she of course did. And it's about a very young woman called Lucy whose father dies in the first chapter, and she goes outside after his death, and there in the lane she meets a man called Mr. Wemyss, who is very peculiar, starts talking about himself and all his woes, but somehow that's what Lucy feels she needs, and they get closer. He starts to worm his way into her life until suddenly they're inseparable and he's proposed to her and they get married. And when she goes back to live with Mr. Wemyss, she realises that he has had a previous wife who died under mysterious circumstances, and he's not quite the charmer that she once thought he was. It's described on the back as a sinister thriller, and I would definitely agree with that. I would say if there's any part of you that doesn't like to read about manipulative, coercive relationships, very abusive relationships, this probably isn't the one for you, because it was so powerful in the way that it discussed these things, in the way that you feel like you are the main character, and that was why I had to slow down my reading, because I couldn't take it, because I felt quite panicked as I read it. That doesn't mean that it's a bad book, it means that it made me feel something as a reader. I don't want to feel happy every time I read a book, I want to feel as the main character is feeling. And for that, Elizabeth von Arnim gets all the points, because she made it such an immersive reading experience. I don't think I'll be reading this again anytime soon, because it just was so much, so in your face. But if you've read something like Rebecca and want to read something similar, I would definitely recommend this. I feel like Rebecca might be slightly superior, but it's still so brilliant, and like I said, intense is the only word I can use to describe this. It was full on right from the beginning. A type of book I have been loving so far this year is history books. In particular, history books that don't feel like you're reading history, that feel like you're being told a story at the same time. And the first one of these I read was The Five by Hallie Reubenhold, which I'd heard a lot about. And this looks at the victims of the Jack the Ripper murders, which happened in London in 1888. And rather than looking at them as gruesome murders that need to be solved, it actually looks at the victims' lives, the 5 women who died in the autumn of 1888. It looks at the run-up to their deaths, the way that they grew up, it looks at their lives, and it is an excellent social history. It's come under fire since its publication by so-called ripperologists who don't think that the victims' lives should be explored, who think that it's all about the murder. And Hallie Reubenhold goes, no, it's not about that. Why are we focusing on something that is horrific? Why are we glorifying it? Why aren't we looking at the actual women? And often when people talk about the victims, they talk about them as prostitutes. That's always the term that they use to talk about them. One, because it's easy to do so, because they see them as women who didn't really deserve to live. It doesn't matter that they died because look what they were doing with their lives. And I think the huge problem in doing that is, one, we diminish the lives of the women who weren't sex workers, and two, we don't look at the few women who were working in the sex trade and looking at the conditions that they lived in and the way in which they lived that affected the course of their lives. So Hallie Reubenhold has set out to put the record straight on this, and I think she does an excellent job. Some of it is of course guesswork, but I think it's quite accurate guesswork. It's about putting a picture together and telling a story within that narrative that is as accurate as it ever can be without the survival of written or available sources. This was the first of the history books that I've read recently, and I was surprised going in at how quickly I raced through this. I read this in a matter of a few days because I wanted to know, I wanted to read more about the women and their lives. It's incredibly detailed and will teach you so much about what it was like to be a working class woman at the end of the 19th century. I would really recommend this. There is certainly good reason why so many people have read it and why it has won so many prizes. It really is fantastic. And then I haven't finished it quite yet, but I am currently reading Black Diamonds by Catherine Bailey, which is incredible. Another history book that I cannot put down. It reads like a mystery, and even though you know you're reading about real life, a story that has been pieced together, it feels like you're reading the most page-turning thriller, and that's what I love about this. This is all about the country seat Wentworth Woodhouse, which is situated in Yorkshire, and it follows the rise and fall of the House of Wentworth from the beginning of the 20th century to the end of it. It's shrouded in mystery because most of the papers that recorded the family's history were destroyed. People had a lot to cover up, including the fact that the 6th Earl might actually have been a changeling child who was born in the wilds of Canada and swapped into the family. Even though it does talk about the glorious Edwardian days and the incredible lavish wealth of the family, it also talks about the social history of the area, about the mining villages which Wentworth House was built upon with the profits of mining. And so you hear about the lives of the miners, their families, what it was like to be a miner at this time, with the general strike of 1926, of other strikes and unionism going on in the early 20th century. It talks about the Earl's illegitimate children and the mysteries surrounding them. And if The Five teaches you about late 19th century history, then this teaches you about early 20th century social history, which is what I find the most interesting. I love this. I'll probably talk about this a bit more at some point in another video just because it's fantastic, but I'm probably going to finish it this weekend because I cannot wait to find out what happens for the rest of the 20th century. I just want to know everything about it, and Catherine Bailey is a fantastic storyteller. So there we have it. Those are the books that I have read so far in 2021. I would love to know what you have read and enjoyed so far this year, so do let me know in the comments below. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Happy reading!